Hi, this is Simon Obstill and welcome to another tutorial for Apple Motion. Now, one of the very first tutorials I ever made for Apple Motion was one in which I showed how to turn text into smoke. And over the years I've played around with different methods for doing this, and I thought I would show you my latest thoughts on the matter. So let's get going. Okay, for this project I'm going with 1920 1080, frame rate of 25 frames a second and a duration of 8 seconds. So the first thing I want to do is type my text, so I shall come back when that's done because it always takes forever. So here we go, this is the text that we'll be working with. If you're interested, the font is ITC Avant-Garde Gothic Pro. I've tried to make it central and big. So the theory behind this is that we are going to turn the text itself into a particle system, rather than what you usually see, which is the text sort of dissolving or transitioning into some smoky kind of particles, which always looks like a bit of a cheat. So in order to be able to do this, we are going to clone this group. So right click, make clone layer, and then we are going to make an emitter out of this clone. So object make particles. And then you'll see that we get this sort of effect. So I think this is quite a good place to start. So the one thing I want to do is I don't want the emitter to begin right at the beginning, so we've got a nice hold at the start. So I'm going to come to frame 20 on the timeline and mark in. So now that we won't start emitting until then. And I'm just going to turn off my original smoke layer. We don't need to see that smoke group there. Let's just set up this emitter. So first of all, let's set up the birth rate. So I'm going to come to 20 frames on the timeline and I'm going to keyframe the birth rate. I'm going to step back one frame and I'm going to set that birth rate down to 0, step back to 20, make it 100, step forward one frame and make it 0 again. So it's only going to emit on that first frame. So now let's come down to the life and set that to 8. Let's have 3 for the life randomness. Let's have 150 for the speed and 150 for the speed randomness. And now smoke isn't white, so what we're going to do is come to colorize for the color mode. And let's set the color to be something like 60% gray. Then let's set up the opacity over life. Let's click roughly here to set a new opacity tag. Let's set that location to be 2. Let's click on the first one here and set that opacity down to 0. Let's create a new opacity tag over on the right that we drag all the way to the right and set its opacity down to 0 as well. So then it's all going to fade off over life. The other thing we need to do is set up the direction. So for the emission angle, we're going to have 90 degrees. And that's going to send it upwards like that. We don't want quite such a wide emission range. I'm going to go with 120 for the emission range. So now it kind of moves up like that. So now we've got our basic emitter set up, we can start to make this look a bit more like smoke. One thing I do need to do is to come down here and turn off random start frames. And I'm going to set the source frame offset to 10. Now currently we don't have any animation on our source particle, but we're going to do that by coming to this group here. And the first thing we want to do is add some blur. So I'm going to come to blur and Gaussian blur. So let us first of all come to frame 20. Let's set the Gaussian blur amount down to 0 and keyframe it. Let's step forward to frame 30 and set this amount up to 128. So now you can see we've got this more smoky effect because the source particles are being blurred like that. So let's add something more. What I want to do is grab from the library generators a clouds, and I'm going to drag it into a new group at the back here. So let's just set up these clouds. All I want to do is I want to increase the vertical scale to 48. And also while I'm at it, I'm going to come into the offset, the Y offset, right click, add parameter behavior and ramp. And I'm going to set that N value to 1. And that's going to make the clouds drift up like that in a kind of smoky fashion. So we're not actually going to be seeing the clouds themselves, but we're actually going to use them in two different ways. And I'm going to call this group displace plus matte, and we can now turn it off. So let's first of all use it as the matte for this particle group. Let's call this text source, be easier to understand, and this is going to be particles. Okay, so our text source group, we're going to add an image mask, right click, add image mask. We're going to use our displace and matte group as the mask source, and we're going to switch to luminance. And you can see what that does is it breaks up those elements like that. And we're already starting to look quite a bit more smoky. So the next thing we want to do is add some more filters to this text source group. So let's select it and come to filters and distortion and bump map. And let's use this displace matte group as the bump map source. Let's set the bump direction to 180 so it goes upwards, and let's keyframe the amount. So let's come again to frame 20 and set a keyframe for the amount. Let's set that to 0. Let's come forward to frame 60 and set that amount to 0.5. And you can see that's really helping to break up that smoke quite a bit like that. What it is doing though is it's kind of giving us this rather odd sort of distortion. And we can fix that by actually duplicating that Gaussian blur. So right click, duplicate, and dragging it above the bump map. So then if I turn that on and off, you can see we're getting that nice distortion, but we're back to it looking a bit more smoke-like. What I might just try is after that bump map is adding a distortion and underwater. And I just want to set its speed down to 0, and let's also keyframe its refraction. So let's come to 20 frames again, come back to the underwater. Let's set the refraction down to 0 and keyframe it. And let's come forward to 30 frames. And let's set that refraction up to 120. And if I turn that on and off, you can see it's giving us more kind of smoky dispersal. So that's probably helping in conjunction with that bump map. So the other thing I want to do finally to this group is give it a little bit more definition. So select the group and come to filters and sharpen and unsharp mask. I'm going to set the radius to 32 and the amount to 2. And you probably can't see with the screen recording, but it is just going to sharpen things up and give it a little bit more sense of detail, because smoke does actually want detail in it. We're never going to get a great deal of detail with this method, but good idea to try and preserve it where we can. So the next thing I want to do is just blur the emitter, so we don't see this bit here where we're starting to see the text sort of separate. So if we come to this emitter, come to filters and blur and Gaussian blur. I actually think I'll put it on the particles group. Why not? Let's do that. And again, let's come to frame 20 and let's set the amount down to 0, keyframe it. Let's come forward to frame 30 and let's set the amount up to 128. And hopefully that is just going to take, yes, that takes care of that bit there where we were seeing those sort of separate layers. So now we're not seeing the separate layers like that. That's looking quite a bit better. Oh, and while I'm on the subject of the emitter, let's just add a gravity to it, just to get it to rise a little bit quicker. So simulations and gravity, and let's have -50 for the gravity. It's just going to pull it up a little bit faster. You'll notice that obviously we don't see anything at the beginning here. We need to see our text static. So in order to do that, I'm going to, I think, select my text here, and just above it I'm going to make a group. So object new group, drop the text into that group, and then I'm going to clone the group. So right click, make clone layer, and then I'm going to drag this clone all the way up to the top here into its own new group. So we'll need to do a little bit of a transition out of this. The first thing I want to do is to take the group and again add an image mask to it, and again use my displace matte as the source, and again switch to luminance. And you can see how that breaks that up. Now we want it to animate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the image mask and come to color and levels, And let's open up the histogram, RGB, and you'll notice that if I animate this black out value, a value of 1, the mask has no effect, but if we reduce it down to 0, it does have an effect. So what we can do is we can come to frame 20, we can keyframe that black out amount at 1, and then we can come forward to frame 30 and set that amount down to 0. And so that's going to, as you see, just progressively take it out like that. But we also do need to fade it. So let's take the clone, let's come to 20 frames on the timeline, let's keyframe the opacity, let's come to 30 frames and set the opacity down to 0 like that. And now that's kind of looking like that. I think what we'll probably also need to do is just blur that as well. So let us come to filters and blur and Gaussian blur. Again, let's come to frame 20. Let's set the amount down to 0 and keyframe it. And then let's step forward to frame 25 and set that amount up to 64. And I think that's just going to take care of that transition like that. So how's that looking? There you go, text to smoke. I think that's pretty much it. You might even decide you want to add in some extra smoke particles or even a photographic smoke element, but those are the basic techniques that you can combine to create this effect. So I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.